Gabriela? Luis. Go ahead, Luis.
Okay. So what we saw is that, about the ancient hatred thing in the lecture, they talk about the new consensus, which is actually quite far from the ancient hatred. And the focus on ethnicity here shows that there wasn't an invention of ethnic categories, but those categories were already existing. And it was the fact that those categories were already pre-existing that allowed the association Tutsi with enemies, and that there was the author says, mechanism of collective ethnic categorization. And so it isn't an ancient hatred, but it's an instrumentalization of those pre-existing categories.
Good, very good. So yeah, it is not ancient hatreds, but that doesn't mean that the ethnicity categorization doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. It exists, it was there, it was used, it was crucial that this category was there and was actually shaping Rwandan politics. You know, it is not an artificial category. It had been there for a good period of time, right? And it had been politicized for the past 20, 30 years. So it was a politicized ethnicity, as we discussed a few weeks ago. And the fact that there was a politicization of that ethnicity not necessarily means we're talking of ancient hatreds. Ivana, can you share your thoughts, please?
Yes, I wanted to say something that we cannot say like ancient, because when they were colonialized, this like categorization of Hutus and Tutsis were like a little bit how I say, like like they change a little.
Exactly.
Because when the Belgians get there, they start like classifying people by, I don't know, the size of the nose and a lot of things that were not like really related with what was Tutsis and Hutus. And also we say something important in our group, that was that they have similar characters, because also they talk the same language, so they were like not that far of each other. And other thing that we said, it was that when you talk about Asian hatreds, you have to be like hating the other one. And we see that they live next to each other for a long time, and they also get married between them. So it was more like as Luis says, like a something of the time, like they use these categories and politicize them.
Exactly. Very good. Thank you very much for those interventions from Luis and Ivana. So that's right. The categories had changed a lot. It didn't mean the same in the colonial period. Before the colonial period, in the colonial period. Then it was in the past, in the recent history, like in the 20th century, that these categories were kind of fixed to identity cards. And they were made more like a more fixed identity, but that doesn't mean that didn't mean that the people from the different ethnicities couldn't coexist, couldn't intermarry, couldn't live together, do the same activities. So there aren't many evidence. There isn't a lot of evidence of collective hatred and collective antagonism. There is politics around it, of course, because the government was Tutsi first, and they excluded the Hutus, and then a Hutu revolution came over and excluded the Tutsis. Many left to neighboring countries, and then from those neighboring countries, several decades later, a rebellion started, right? The RPF was formed. But what was novel of this period of time, of the right before the genocide, was the use of the ethnic category, the Tutsis, and to make them pretty much like synonym of the rebel group, of the rebellion. And that is something that happens a lot in wars. Like if we think about the Colombian conflict, for instance, in several places where the FARC had important strongholds, being a coca farmer, a coca cropper, for periods of time was linked automatically with being a member of the guerrilla, right? There was this automatic connection between cultivating, cropping coca and being a member of the guerrilla. And the majority of the people that cropped coca were not guerrilleros, but the association was done. And so they were victimized in enormous degrees in the past years. Good. What about the second question? The second question was asked about the role of the war on genocide. Anyone wants to share what the group discussed regarding this question? What is the role of war? If you want, you can raise your hand, please. Laura, go ahead.
Well, we discussed that the war set an environment where it was able for the government to instrumentalize ethnicity and to present the Tutsis as a security threat.
Right, exactly. So it's probably impossible for this genocide to happen without the context of war. So it was the context of war that produced maybe the most important aspect that explains this, which is the insecurity of the elites. The elites felt very threatened. They felt threatened by the war. They felt threatened by the peace agreements with the RPF. And the context of war led to a security dilemma, and also gave, when there is a security threat and when there is a war, then the military and hardliner members of the elite, they have more margin and more influence. So this context of war explains a lot of the genocide. And the last question on the role of the state. Anyone wants to share what is the role of the state? Valentina, go ahead.
Yes, so what we discussed mainly was that it is thanks to the state structure and also to the military organization and even the bureaucratic organization of the state that it was easy for the hardliners order to commit genocide to reach all the country, basically, because in not as the other states of most African states, the Rwanda state is very organized, and also people respect the authority, tend to respect the authority and obedience.
Very good. Right.
But also another thing that I would like to say about it is that something that makes me reflect is that about the role of the international community. Once again, it was clear that national authority is still something that has wider consensus than international authority. I mean, the fact that the state sovereignty is so is such a complicated concept also makes it difficult for the international community to intervene, and when it is mixed to a lack of interest for a certain country, it leads to the absolute misknowledge even of this kind of situations. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, actually, the Rwandan genocide was very important to establish norms in the international community regarding the responsibility to protect. And it's this ideology, if you look at that way, that it's called like that, responsibility to protect. So it is like this idea that the international community left the Rwandan civilians completely on their own to fend for themselves, and that the international community has responsibility because it had the capacity, it was on the ground, it had the capacity to observe firsthand the situation, and yet decided to protect the blue helmets and to protect the members of the mission that was stationed there, rather than intervening. And why did that happen? That happened for several reasons. Like this type of interventions had problems in the past, right? Like we had the Srebrenica massacre, right? And also the humanitarian disaster in Somalia. It had happened 2 years ago. So the international community didn't want to get involved into this. And then after the genocide, there is a feeling of guilt from the international community, and some sort of development to avoid this from happening again. But yet we have like these events happening again in Syria, with large masses being killed. The same with the Yazidis, and also with the Rohingya. So it reveals that things have changed, of course, but if there is lack of political will to intervene in the like domestic politics drive a lot of these decisions by the states, right? Like in this moment, the United States really doesn't want to get involved into anything because it doesn't think that it has to pay for any humanitarian intervention. And also this like geopolitical opposition between Russia, China, and other states in the Security Council in the United Nations is also putting limits and obstacles to intervention in some of these conflicts. Part of that is reacting to what happened in Libya that led to a really large amount of civilians killed in this operation by the international community, and also geopolitical kind of movements and balance of power. So right now, like even though the Rwandan genocide set the stage to lead to some changes and to more intervention of the international community, it has still failed to avoid at least 2 recent instances of genocide. So the part of the state is very important because we generally think that the Rwandan state is weak as all, states in Africa, which is really bad to think that way. Like we like to simplify a lot Africa. Africa is a very complex continent with very different nations, different degrees of authority, different capacities of a state, but we tend to oversimplify, to do gross simplifications and say that all African states are super weak, they collapsed, they are failed states. And this is simply not true. And it is not true in the case of Rwanda in particular, because the state have had lots of authority for a really long period of time. It's a hierarchical society. Their modern state inherited a lot of the power of authority of previous monarchies. And so the state has deep roots in society. It has the ability to impact people's lives even in the countryside. And that some of that has to do with geography, which I think it's a really interesting aspect of the discussion in Strasbourg, and is the fact that the country doesn't have a rough geography. Rather than that, there are some hills, they are cultivated, and there is little exit. So this idea that the people are encaged, that they are easy to see and they are easy to monitor and to surveil, helps a lot to like increase the power of the state. So do you guys watch here the slide, right? Yes?
Yes.
Just the slide?
Yes, just a slide.
Okay, good. So this shows us a little bit how the genocide escalated in Rwanda. First, we have, before the assassination of the president in 1994, the Rwandans were radicalizing and preparing for war There were also killings of Tutsis, although it was not systematic and it was not generalized. Then it is important to see the main actors in this story are the hardliners, los duros, of the Hutu side. And these hardliners that were the government in the moment, they were facing challenges. So this happened in a context in which, on the one hand, the state is strong, but the power of the elite is eroding, is deteriorating. So, these two things, they provide like the ingredients for the genocide. The state is strong, but the elite is suffering, and it's suffering from two different fronts. Number one, all the changes brought by the end of the Cold War. We have discussed a lot about that in this class. The end of the Cold War meant for the ruling parties that they had to open the political arena, that they had to accept participation of opposition groups and to accept participation of other groups into government. So the rulers, the single ruling party, it was forced to open the political contestation and to implement a multi-party regime. And this led to the creation of a Hutu moderate party, the AMRD. So the Hutu moderate party was threatening the hardliners' hold on power. They were threatening the political elite that was in the government at that moment. But then on the other side, the other source of threat were the Tutsi exiles that initiated a civil war. So the elite was really threatened. And then they signed the Arusha Accords, and that peace agreement was really lenient towards the rebels. It gave the rebels a lot. That contributed to the erosion of the hardliners' hold on power. So despite the peace treaty, the RPF and the hardliners, they were preparing for war. And in this moment that was already very polarized and stressed, the president was killed. And then a period of crisis and uncertainty followed. And the hardliners moved quickly to secure their hold on power, and they killed first the Hutu moderates, right? They didn't start killing Tutsi. So it really tells us about the fact that it was a move by the Hutu political elite to secure their hold on power. And in the midst of this, they declared, the Hutu hardliners declared Tutsis to be the enemy, all Tutsis, and they called Hutus to eliminate them. Since the state was very strong, this came as a policy from the state, as an order of the central authorities, through the channel of the state institutions that had really deep roots in the countryside. So in the local level, hardliners saw this as an opportunity to gain power too. So they gained power and they started to implement this policy of killing the Tutsis. They worked with thugs, with members of militia and the military, and they started to kill Tutsis all over the place. Why people killed? Because there was this history of doing what the state required, this history of compulsory work, this history of peer pressure. So they demanded the mobilization of ordinary Hutu, and they were expected to be part of the killings and be part of the atrocities. So there was a lot of intra-Hutu coercion. And this was backed by a really long tradition of mobilization by the state. And also this was helped by the lack of exit opportunities. People like a Hutu person said, I have two options. I will be killed or I participate in the killings. So I will participate in the killings because it is my safest option. I have nowhere to go, right? Because there are no places where to escape and be hidden. And so intra-Hutu coercion and the lack of exit options forced people to take the decision to be part of the atrocities. Okay, folks, we ran out of time. I don't want to keep you longer. Maybe we can finish this slide next week. So we have next week we have a class on rape. So I would like to make a survey, and I would like to know, please raise your hand if you want next class, which is on sexual violence, to be synchronic. Raise your hand if you want this class to be synchronic rather than asynchronic. If you want synchronic, raise your hand. Okay. Okay, we have about 18, actually 20 to 10. Yeah, we have about 20 to 12. So we will do next class. It will be synchronic. And the next week we will have an asynchronic and asynchronic class. But then I figured that maybe you guys want to meet and discuss in person about this topic. So I'm going to, anyone wants to ask a question? Any questions here? There are a few questions. No questions. Okay. No questions. Good. So Stan, actually, you have a question. Go ahead. No, you don't have a question.
No, so sorry. I leave the hand raised.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I cleared them all. So, okay, guys. So let's see you then on Thursday. Same hour. And we have the documentary, which is, the first 30 to 40 minutes of that documentary, and also the podcast. There is a transcription of the podcast if you want, but you can just listen to the podcast, and then that will give us a lot of material to discuss during class. So thank you very much for coming here today. I will leave these recordings on eAulas and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, teacher.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.